All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 13, Section 2, Antebellum Communal Experiments. So let's recall that in the Antebellum period, which is the period before the Civil War, we'll say roughly 1820 to 1860, that both the market and industrial revolutions changed society, right? And changed it pretty dramatically. Some of these changes were not all for the better, right? Some of these had, or, we'll say made society worse, especially when you consider things like what had gone on in urban cities with the rise of the factory system, massive amounts of people moving to those areas, the cesspool of pollution, disease, crime, general sin that was going on in the urban areas. So not things, things that weren't generally considered good. Most people's reaction to this, right, is to reform society, right, simply to reform. However, there's a small constituency, right, that's the word I'm looking for, small constituency that says, no, society is so far bad we can't reform it. Instead, let's make new societies. And those people are the Utopians, right? Utopian societies. And as you can see, a lot of them are based off of religion, although they don't necessarily technically have to be. The word utopian pretty much means like perfect world. So there's the desire to create the perfect world, and different groups of people, small numbers, right? These are not very large societies, but small number of people really take kind of more radical and extreme measures to try and create a better society separate from the corrupt and sort of new society that was created in the Antebellum period. One thing to point out, and we covered this in the last section, 13-1, that you have this major religious revival going on at the time. So a lot of these societies are based in Christianity, specifically Protestant Christianity. And we'll just sort of go down the laundry list and just mention some examples of these, again, very small, but, groups of people who want to radically change society for the better. Piestic societies, you could think of the word piety. These are religious societies that sought to separate themselves completely from the mainstream American society. The Rappites maybe are one example of this. This was created by George Rapp, a German immigrant. And, in these societies, one could focus on spirituality, religiosity. They can distance themselves from kind of the dog-eat-dog sort of capitalist world and instead focus only on things like discipline, spirituality, and separation from, sort of the mainstream society. Some more well-known examples include the Shakers and the Oneida community, the Shakers who you see right here, which were given that name because of the dance they performed. The Shakers believed that the chief virtue to follow would be celibacy. And so in this community, the men and women, in fact, not only abstained from any type of sexual contact, but lived completely separate from one another. So men and women lived separately. So there'd be separate bunkers for all, or separate kind of facilities for the men, separate facilities for the women. Celibacy was the chief virtue, believing that that was kind of the root of all sinfulness and everything wrong with society. But then every once in a while, the two groups would get together, perform this dance, which was very impressive to, outside onlookers, and that's where they got the name the Shakers. The Oneida community was a little bit different. They practiced the virtue of the Holy Family, which was essentially stated that all members of the group were married. And so believing that monogamy was actually the problem, that if people were free and open to have romantic and sexual relations with whoever they desired, that would get rid of a lot of the problems in society. So looking at one of the kind of fundamental pillars of American culture at this time, which was monogamous marriage. John Humphrey Noyes was the leader of the Oneida And again, all of these groups, right, kind of getting small membership. Again, most individuals, most people are not willing to, give up or practice complete celibacy. Most are not willing to give up on monogamous marriage, but you do have these very small groups that are willing to do that. Probably the most successful, probably not even just probably, but the most successful one of these separate religious communities was Mormonism. Mormonism was founded by Joseph Smith, so he is the founder of Mormonism. From a farm family in New York, which was going through a lot of the changes taking place in the market revolution. Joseph Smith was visited by Moroni. This was an angel who revealed a prophecy to Joseph Smith, revealed the golden tablets, which then were written in the Book of Mormon, which is the Mormon text. And so this religion that Joseph Smith was practicing was kind of in some ways a way to bring back church and state. We have to call that because of the American Revolution, there was a lot more religious freedom. A lot of laws got rid of some of the religious requirements. Mormonism preached the message that would bring back church and state, that religious law and societal law would be one and the same once again. It promoted much more structure as compared to something like the Second Great Awakening, which was much more individualistic. So this was more communal, I would say, and provided a lot more structure within church and within society. However, Mormons themselves were persecuted very frequently, and one of the reasons was the practice of polygamy by leading members. Polygamy is the practice of having many wives, right? So as opposed to having one single wife, husbands were allowed to take on multiple wives. It was also the insistence that Joseph Smith was practicing kind of the right version of Christianity and everybody else was practicing the incorrect version. And so the Mormons didn't make themselves a lot of friends. In fact, the founder, Joseph Smith, in the 1840s was murdered by a mob. And that resulted in leadership being passed down to Brigham Young, who became the Mormon leader after Joseph Smith. He led what they call the Mormon Exodus, or the Mormon Trek. And the Mormon community moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. This was out in the West, where really it thrived in that area, so it can get away from some of the persecution that it had experienced. Here's Joseph Smith right here. Some of the persecution that it experienced in the United States at the particular time. And of course, to this very day, Mormonism is alive and well in the United States, and in fact has become a religion not just in America, where it was created, but in fact also all across the world. So probably the most successful of these communities to sprout up in the Antebellum period. Now, there were other utopian communities that were not based in religion, secular, right? Secular means non-religious. Brook Farm in Massachusetts was one example, very closely tied to the transcendentalist movement. This was much more of an intellectual movement. And one of its members was Nathaniel Hawthorne, of course, who was a famous American author, writing things like The Scarlet Letter, which you may or may not have read before. It was very short-lived, very small membership, but again, kind of this group of intellectuals that really critiqued and criticized American society. Another example of a secular utopian society was that created by Robert Owen. He was a factory owner. Very much concerned about the exploitation of workers. He was, you could say, maybe anti-capitalist. He had a real problem with the economic system, and he wanted to create a factory system in which workers weren't exploited, they were given meaningful pay, they were given a place to live. His followers purchased a factory village in New Harmony, Indiana, to create a communal society, right there. And followers of Robert Owen called themselves Owenites. This was kind of this is before Karl Marx, right? So this is before really those ideas relating to communism surfaced in Europe in the 1850s. But followers of Robert Owen really, looked at some of the bad aspects of capitalism, especially how it affected workers. This community in New Harmony, Indiana, ultimately failed due to infighting. But again, sort of interesting to see some of the way that individuals thought to, again, create or perfect some of the things wrong with American society. Talking about Robert Owen, one thing that I actually want to just add here real quick before I forget, and that was the Piestic Societies. Not only was piety the chief value, but you also had in many of these societies communal ownership. So again, kind of getting away from this idea of private or individual property, which could be seen as, one of the ills or one of the problems with American society, that instead, if there was less private property, more communal ownership, perhaps, society could be made better again. The Piestic Societies, of course, based very heavily on religion, whereas if you look at what Robert Owen created in New Harmony, Indiana, there was really no religious connotations to it. It was purely secular.